All right, hello. So in this video, we're going to be talking about Bootstrap, which is a CSS framework, which is designed to basically help you style a web page more quickly, to be able to effectively bootstrap your sort of design and your styling, your CSS process. So we'll talk about in this video. We'll talk about what we mean by a CSS framework and give you a little bit of introduction to that. We'll talk about how we can include Bootstrap in any website that we're developing, and then we'll talk about how we sort of use Bootstrap to style our page using what are called utility classes. All right. So a CSS framework is basically a set of CSS rules that someone else has written, that have been published and made available for you to use and that you are able to include in your web page. So rather than you writing your own CSS rules, right, using sort of all the skills and materials that we've talked about over the last couple of weeks, you're basically going to use a bunch of rules that have already been provided to you. This will already give you styling to your page. And then what you'll do is you'll write your HTML so that it achieves the styling you want by effectively matching it to what the CSS says you need to do, particularly through the use of classes. And again, we'll go through lots of examples of sort of how this works with Bootstrap. So Bootstrap is an example of a CSS framework. There are many CSS frameworks out there, but Bootstrap is kind of one of the oldest and most popular of those frameworks. So we're using Bootstrap as an example that you're most likely to encounter, though other frameworks are going to follow a similar kind of idea, and they'll work in similar kinds of ways. So just from a little bit of history, Bootstrap was originally created by Twitter back in 2011, so it's about a little over a decade old at this point. It's often sort of referred to as Twitter Bootstrap. Effectively, what it was is that Twitter designed a set of CSS rules that says, here's how we want to have all of our tools and all of our system work. And then they said, hey, this is a really cool idea. Let's share it out with everybody else so other people can also use all this like groundwork and all the structure we built to try to create make Twitter look nice. They can use it to also make their websites look nice as well. So Bootstrap is now currently it's still technically owned by Twitter, but it's kind of managed separately from Twitter. But you'll often hear it referred to as Twitter Bootstrap. And sort of that's again where this thing came about and how this thing come together. Okay, so let's talk about how we go about including Bootstrap. So the first thing you can note is that you can go find Bootstrap's website. Their website is getbootstrap.com, and that's where you'll be able to find all the details about how to actually use Bootstrap. We're going to be referring back to this site a lot because this is the documentation. This is where we're going to learn where you could go to learn how do I do something in particular by using Bootstrap. It has some tutorial-ish kind of work mostly, but more just saying, here's a list of all the rules and here's sort of how you might use them to achieve particular styling effects. Okay, so let's talk about how we actually include the framework. So what we're going to do in order to include Bootstrap on our website is we're going to just include a link, just like we've included links before for other style sheets, but instead of linking to, say, a file that's inside of our own local folder, right, going into our CSS folder and then including mystyle.css. Instead, our href is going to point to a website, right? We're going to go look at a file on the internet, right? We're going to go to https:// some domain, some path, and some really long path that says, here's where I can then go find Bootstrap. You can see this particular link from the documentation. So if we go to our website and we scroll down, there's a section that says include via CDN. And right there is the link that you would use to copy into your website in order to include Bootstrap. All right, so the example website I'm going to be playing around with is I'm going to keep using this sort of my personal homepage example. This is similar to what we used in our Flexbox example and some of our CSS property examples from previous videos, but we're just now we deleted all the CSS and we're now going to just style it using Bootstrap. So same HTML, but zero styling. Our styling is now empty. All right. So what we can do is we can take this link and we would include it in our file. Right? And we would just go ahead and take our link and we would paste it in to our, oh gosh, sorry, wrong copy thing. There we go. And we just paste it into our file. It loads in a link that has a particular href and has a particular relationship. And then we'll talk about these other things in just a second. I shall talk about them now. So it also includes what's called an integrity attribute, which is including effectively, think of it like a verification code that says that made sure that when you're linking this other external file, you're actually downloading the correct version of the file and nothing's gotten corrupted or maliciously changed in some kind of way. And then the cross-origin request basically says, yes, it's okay to allow us to include this file from a different website, right? From a different server, a different page than we're the one we'd be currently using. Okay. So this is an example, right? This website, https://cdn.jsdeliver.net, is an example of what's called a CDN, which stands for Content Delivery Network. A CDN is basically, think of it as a server, right? It's a set of places where a bunch of web content can live, where what it hosts are libraries and frameworks and sort of other bits of code that get used in your web page. The general idea here is that by linking to the CDN, we're basically saying that when someone views our web page and they say, okay, I need to go download the CSS file, right, in order to be able to go like render, like make my page look the way it wants, rather than having them download that from our server, right, as part of like alongside our HTML, they're going to go download it from this other server, this other place, this other CDN. And the CDNs are designed to be, they're sort of structured and sort of distributed across the world, so they're very quick to access, right? You're always like, you don't need to go very far along the internet wires to get to a CDN. Moreover, the idea here is that lots of websites in the world use Bootstrap. So if I have visited a site that used Bootstrap in the past, I've already downloaded that CSS, right? My browser is already connected to it, downloaded it, and cached it somewhere, like sort of saved it on my browser's memory so the browser can use it in the future. Which means that then if someone comes and visits my new site that I've created that now uses Bootstrap, the likelihood that that person has already downloaded the CSS file is pretty high, which makes it sort of even faster for them to get the page, to load the page and access it, right? They have to do less data bandwidth, they have to download less stuff. So this is basically the CSS file that we're going to download. We can take a look at it by literally taking this URL, right, again, which is just a web page URL, HTTPS, just like you google.com or whatever.com, and we can put it into our browser. We can say, let's take a look at what this thing is. Oh my gosh, I'm once again copying and pasting incorrectly. So I'm going to copy just the URL itself, and I'm going to go visit that page. And if we do that, what we get is Bootstrap. This is the Bootstrap CSS. Now, if you look at it, this is horrifying. This is impossible to read, right? It's like, oh my gosh, what is going on here? It's just a giant block of text. So this is an example of what's called a minified file. And you can see that in the URL where the name of the file, remember the name of the file comes after the path, right? That's the file that we're trying to load. The name of the file here is bootstrap.min.css. The .min in the file name isn't doing anything magical. It's just a convention, right? It's just sort of a standard way that we write file names in order to indicate that we write a file name that way when that file is done what's called being minimized. Effectively, what we've done is we've taken Bootstrap and it's deleted all the white space. Right, so if you imagine we had a CSS file, like you've got a bunch of spacing between your rules, right? You put each property on their own line. You put each rule on its own line. What the Bootstrap minimized file has done is it's deleted all that extra white space because those line breaks actually aren't needed by the browser. They're needed by people so that people can read what's going on, but the browser doesn't actually care. So by deleting all those white space, we're actually shrinking the file, right? We're making the file smaller so it's faster and quicker to download. Again, this is an optimization step to make it so that when people access your web page, the page loads quicker. So this is a minified file. It's usually the one we'll include. If we want to see what it looks like when it's not minified, we can go look for the file that doesn't have the .min in the file name, right? We're going to look for just bootstrap.css. And when we do that, we can then see the Bootstrap CSS file, which is just a CSS file. It contains a lot of rules that are, and using some CSS techniques that are sort of more advanced that we haven't talked about, and that's okay. But roughly, in general, it's really just a CSS file, pretty much like what you could have written on your own. So for example, here's a good place to start, right? Here's the example of their body tag. Right, and they're styling their body, giving it 0 margin. They're specifying a family, a font size, font weight, and they're using this thing called var variable in order to make it so that they can move in different kinds of values, but we can ignore that for a moment. But basically, they're just defining what the styling is. Here's an HR element, which stands for a horizontal rule. It basically creates like a line, just a horizontal line down the middle of your page, and they're specifying its margin, color, borders, opacity. These are rules that we've seen before. Right. Here's a group selector, right? They're saying let's apply rules to elements that are of type H6 or have the class H6 or H5, class H5, 4, etc. giving it margins, specifying font weights, specifying line heights. Again, these are all the kinds of CSS that you might have written on your own. It has a lot of other pieces, and some of which we'll talk about more in future videos, some of which are just things that we maybe haven't seen yet. And that's okay, right? It's fairly advanced CSS, but really, like, it's more or less doing what you would do on your own, right? We add padding, specify margins, give some font weights, specify what all you want your different elements and your different classes to look like. So the thing to remember when people say they're using Bootstrap, Bootstrap is just CSS. All it is a set of CSS rules that happen to apply to particular classes or happen to apply to particular elements. All right, so we've gone to our CDN and we've included Bootstrap and we loaded it into our page, right? I've now gone ahead and I've pasted it in my head as a link, just like I would include any other CSS file in my link. All right, I'm going to save this. So here's what we looked like before Bootstrap, right? I haven't reloaded the page. When I hit reload, now I'm going to load it with Bootstrap styling Bootstrap style sheet included. You'll notice that suddenly all my styling changes, right? Because now I have a set of rules that say what my HTML should look like. They say what's my standard font, what's my standard margins, what are my headings, what are my footing, what are my headings, what are my paragraphs, what does that all look like? If we open up our developer tools, as always, oh gosh, wrong button. Hold on. Let's see if I can make this so we can see it a little bit better. Yeah, what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna make this a little bigger. I'll select this here. Yeah. So for example, if we go look at our H1, right? Our H1 element has a rule that's coming from, this is from Bootstrap, right? Sort of ignore the complexity of the rule here. That's basically saying what its font size should be, what its margin should be, what its color should be. So all that information, right? All that styling is simply provided by Bootstrap as a framework. We've included this CSS file, and this CSS file says style your H1s to look like this. And so now we've done that. So that's it. With no other work than just including a new link, I can get a fairly decent set of styling, right? My page looks like a lot better, right? I get a lot of sort of nice fonts, I get some nice margins. It looks more like an actual page. All right, and that's the basis of getting Bootstrap installed. Of course, that's not it, right? That just gets some default structuring. But the thing to notice about Bootstrap CSS file is it's really, really long. There is a lot of stuff here, right? You can see how long I'm scrolling. If you look at my little scroll bar off to the side, right? This is a huge file. There's tons of styling rules inside of here, most of which are based on classes. So Bootstrap, the way that we use Bootstrap to style our page is by using a set of what are we called utility classes. Now, Bootstrap has a bunch of rules, right? Again, it's just a CSS file, and those rules are specified to say that if there is an element that has this class, let's give it a particular style. So for example, like this is a way of styling with colors. If there is a paragraph that has a class that's text primary, then it's going to show up in a kind of blue color. We can go find that rule, right, by searching for it. Right, there's my rule that says that if you have an element that has class text primary, give it this particular color. And again, sort of like pretend that it's specifying like a particular blue, and this is sort of how the code, advanced code it uses to specify that blue. So what we can do is we can do exactly that, right? I can say, let's go to my H1 here, for example, and I can give this a class that is text primary. And when I do that, you'll notice that my heading now became blue. The rule that's now applying to my heading when I say, what do you look like, is it says it takes this Bootstrap rule that says applies to elements with class text primary. That's what that selector does. And it styles this particular element. And that's how we gain styling kinds of effects. So what we can do then, Bootstrap has these utility classes and actually has them designed as these modular classes. So this is following that same kind of modular behavior we've talked about before, where each class applies a particular kind of styling. So for example, we can say that I want the, I can say I want my heading to be, how about we could do this, let's be a text light. We'll make it like a light color. And we're going to have my header itself have a, let's change the whole thing. So instead of modifying the H1, let's modify the header element itself. Let's make all of its text light colored. on a dark background. And when we do that, we get a dark background with some light text. And again, what's happening here is I've added two classes, text light and background dark. Remember, there's a space between these two classes. And the Bootstrap style sheet I've included says make the element that any element that has the class text light, which is this header, make its content be white, like colored. And then if it has the BG dark class, make it have a dark background. And there's a bunch of variants of this, right? We can make this a green, it can be success, for example, and now we get sort of a nice-ish kind of green. Yeah, it's a little bit weird. How about at least it's gold-ish, right? Kind of gets where we need to go. We can sort of mix and match these kinds of things. A lot of these class names are named kind of semantically, right? So BG warning is designed to produce the warning color, which is generally kind of a yellow, but it doesn't really necessarily have to be for a warning. Or I'm using it just because it gives me kind of a nice yellowish kinds of color. So that's what sort of a utility class, these utility classes end up doing. Now, there are a lot of utility classes. If we go to the documentation for Bootstrap, right, we're going to go to this see everyone, if you can see it in my nav bar here, there's a docs section. That's going to take me to the documentation for all of Bootstrap, and I can see all of the different things I'm able to custom along this the left-hand side here, all the different things that I'm able to customize. So there's some general content, some layout stuff. We'll talk about that in a moment. I'll talk about forms, then we'll skip the components. But then you get a bunch of helpers and utilities. So for example, here's my colors utility that lets me specify what my different colors look like, right? Here's, again, I'm specifying the text. And if I go to backgrounds, I can specify look for the options for different background colors. And you can sort of mix and match those pieces. So the idea here is that now I can style my page by specifying colors, not by writing my own CSS rules, simply by including the classes that I want to gain the effect that I'm interested in. So if I wanted my About Me section to have a gray background, I can give it a class that could be BG secondary subtle. The subtle piece is new in Bootstrap 5.3 new at the time of this recording, which is the one I happen to include. And that will then give me my effect where I can get my gray background around my About Me section. Okay, and that's our basic of our utility classes. We'll go through a couple more examples in a moment. Let's go through a couple more examples now. So we can specify colors of like text colors. We can specify backgrounds. We can specify spacing, which is margin and padding. The way we specify margin and padding is by using a set of classes with these sort of particular kinds of codes. So for example, if I want to add some more padding to my, maybe I will go back to the dark one, which I know is a little bit dark, but like I think it's a little bit easier to see. Right, that's our block area. So if I want to add some more padding around this element, I could go to my header and say I want to add some padding. So I'm going to use a class that starts with P, and then I'm going to put in what direction I want that padding to be. So, right, you're going to start with the letter. So do you want M for margin, P for padding? Then you're going to say, which sides do I want to apply to? Do I want to apply to everything, in which case I don't leave it blank? Do I want to apply it to just the top, just the bottom, just the start, which is usually the left, just the end, which is usually the right, just the x-axis, right, which is top and bottom, or I'm sorry, left and right, or just the y-axis, which is top and bottom. And then I'm going to put a number, which is basically indicating about like sort of what level, what sort of category of spacing I want to include. So for example, if I say I want to include P3, I'm going to say I want 3 sort of spaces worth of padding, sort of level 3 padding all around my element. I'm not specifying a top or bottom, so just add level 3 padding all around it. Ta-da, we add level 3 padding all around it. If I want it to be smaller, like level 1 padding, I can say just add level 1 padding. Maybe 2 might look nice. Level 2 padding is a little bit. If I want some padding just on the bottom, I would say PB, say 4, for example, will make it really big. Oh, sorry, no dash. I think it's just P. I think it's just PB. Let me double check. Yep, and there's examples, and Bootstrap has examples for what the rule looks like if you need to double check how that works. So if I say, let's add some padding on the bottom, that's 4 spaces worth of padding here. Notice I have 2 different padding rules, and that's okay, right? I've said add, effectively you can imagine it's almost like writing a property that says add padding of two sets, right? It's not pixels, it's not EMs, it's just saying 2 sort of spaces worth. And this says then add some padding to the bottom of 4, and that padding on the bottom is more specific, so I'll override the previous one. So that adds lots of padding along the bottom. I could then, of course, add some margin on the bottom. Maybe I'll add 2 units of margin to put a little space between these 2 elements. And I can begin styling what my page looks like. So again, all I'm doing here is instead of writing my own CSS rule, right? Notice my CSS is still blank. I haven't written any CSS. I'm simply adding classes to my elements on my page in order to effectively write the same rule I would have written in CSS. But now I can do it just with HTML. Right? I don't need to write an actual CSS rule. I can simply say, hey, I want this header to have this particular set of styling, add some classes that will do that. Note that these are particular classes, right? There's a class called MB2. I can't say NB 2.5, right? There's not like, you can't make up your own sort of numbers here. The numbers aren't actually meaning anything. They're just happen to be the labels they've used to say that an MB2 is 2 spacers worth of padding, right? If I do MB 2.5, you'll notice that my margin goes away because that's not actually a class that anybody understands. All right. And that's how we can begin adding styling to things. So again, there's all kinds of aspects that we're able to modify. We can change the borders, we can change the text, the alignment, the opacity. We can even modify the flexing behavior using Flexbox. So this is going to go back to the Flexbox material we covered in a previous lecture. If I want to change the display property of an element, I want to give it a display flex to make it a Flexbox. I can do that by adding a class called dflex. So we can do something similar to what we did in the Flexbox example, where I said, let's put my little course cards here inside of a Flexbox. Well, we can do that. We can say, I want this thing here to be my Flexbox, right? That's going to be my card deck, my container that's going to have all the cards laid out inside the Flexbox. I can give it a dflex, and ta-da, now it's listed as being a dflex. If I want to, of course, be able to see the borders around this, I can do that, right? I can add some class. I actually haven't used the border one recently. Let's give it a class border. I'll give it a border. Border. All right. That's a really subtle border. How about we'll do border dark? Maybe I'll make it a little bigger. All right, border dark. So here's what I did, right? I said I want this to be darker, and if you look through Bootstrap's documentation, what it'll do is it'll show you examples of what all the different classes look like, and then it has the HTML code that was used to generate that. And then sometimes you have to kind of match to be like, okay, well, here's the first box, here's the second box. You have to sort of count your way through things, but you can see examples of how exactly you would use these classes to define a particular set of styling. So if I go back here, there, right, there's my border around that box. Now, the thing that you'll note, of course, is that adds a border around one of these boxes. If I want to add another border around the other box, I'm going to, of course, have to modify that div to say, give you a border, modify this div to give you a border, right? I have to go through all 3 things. And then if I decide I don't want my border to be dark, but instead I want to actually be like yellow, or what is another color I can use? Let's have it be green, right? I can use a border success. Right now I got a green border. If I want to change it for all these things, I'd have to go change it for every single element in my CS, in my HTML. And that can get repetitive, right? That's a lot of like copy and pasting work. You'll do some of that in your exercise work, but like that can get really tedious. That's a situation where we'd probably want to instead add some styling using CSS. So, right, instead of using Bootstrap here to say, and have to duplicate writing border success 4 or 5 times, what I can do is I could give this thing like a class, like this could be my card deck. We're going to call this my course cards, right? And then I can write a rule that says go to my course cards, and then every div that's inside of that, give it a border that's 1 pic solid black, right? We can go ahead and give them a border that it's going to apply to all those elements, replacing sort of my Bootstrap styling. And that way I won't have to keep rewriting this Bootstrap stuff over and over again. If you want to have a particular rule that's going to apply to lots of different elements, in a consistent way, like you say all divs that are inside my course cards, that's when writing your own CSS might actually be a really useful way. So you're not always using Bootstrap or your own CSS. You would mix and match these two things. You'll notice the way we did that, if I sort of scroll back up here, is I just had included my Bootstraps link, and then I included my CSS link as well. And there's how we can do that. So again, like I've just now included two links where I've said load this style sheet, which is going to, of course, cause browser to go to Bootstrap, to go to the CDN. It'll load that. It'll then apply all those Bootstrap rules. And then we'll get to our style sheet. And so then it'll go apply all of our rules next, sort of in that order. What that means we can, of course, then do is we want to change things around, right? If I decide that I want to have my header not be this black color, which I'm kind of not really liking, but if I want its background color to be Rebecca purple, right, to be our nice purple color, I can do that. And when I refresh the page, you'll notice that it stays black, right? I wrote a rule that applies to the header. And I said header be purple, but my header's staying black. The reason that's happening here, right, is if I go into my developer tools and I go look at my header. Here, let me make this a little bit taller so you can see it. Come on, where'd my edge go? There's my edge. So here's my header, right, that I've selected. My header, you'll see, has a couple of classes. It has a background dark, right, styling the color. And you'll notice that if I scroll down the list here, there's my header rule at the bottom, right, coming from my first line of my CSS. But you'll see that it's been crossed out, right? It has been overridden. So I wrote a rule that said my header should have a purple background, but that purple background is being overridden by Bootstrap's rule that says make it dark. Now, the reason that Bootstrap's rule is winning is so things to note, right? My Bootstrap rule comes first, right? Here's Bootstrap. They wrote before ours, and its specificity is 1, right? It's just 0, 1, 0. It has one class, which is the same specificity as mine, which has no, its specificity is higher, right? It has a header. So let's say, okay, I want to make this let's give it my own, let's make our specificity a little bit higher. I'm going to call this a page header. And so we'll change this to be higher specificity. Page header. And notice that it's still not winning, right? I'm still getting crossed out, even though my specificities are now the same. The reason that is because right, you see how it comes to the top, right? It says this is the first thing that's happening, but it's being overridden by the rule further down the page. That's because Bootstrap's rules, when they just do the single styling effect, also include this extra keyword called important, which is basically a hack that says, no, ignore all specificity rules, just always show this element. This element is always the really important one. So it doesn't matter that if my rule is higher specificity or comes later in the page, it means that Bootstrap's rule is going to win. And if you think about it, that makes sense, right? I said I want my header to be styled like a page header, but then I explicitly said, make it have a dark background. If I don't want it to be a dark background, I shouldn't go ahead and try to make my rule more specific to beat Bootstrap, which I can't do without claiming it to be important. What you do with Bootstrap is if you don't want a Bootstrap styling to apply to an element, you delete that proper class. You say, don't make it dark. If you don't want it to be dark, don't tell it to be dark. Right, leave it the way it is, and then I'll get my nice purple background. Right, now my heading rule is applying, and everything's working the way that I want. All right. The one thing you will, though, need to be careful of, right, is that you make sure you're getting the order of these classes in order, or these pages in order. So generally, you always want to put Bootstrap's link before your own style sheet. That way, that if you have a rule that is equally specific, but but you want to override, you want to change what Bootstrap's saying to do, your page will override it, and you'll win because your page is the second one in the list, right? The browser will go apply Bootstrap's default styling, and then it'll go ahead and apply your own styling as well. So if I want to change, for example, the font of my page, or if I want to change my body's font, and I want my body to have a font family of let's go with Papyrus. It's really obvious, right? You'll notice that my font styling becomes Papyrus, right? I'm winning. My rule is overriding Bootstrap's rule because my thing comes second. if I tweak this, right, if I put my, oh my gosh, if I put my CSS first, then you'll notice that I don't get my papyrus rule because I said make everything papyrus, but then Bootstrap comes in and says, no, make everything Helvetica. So this is why we always want to put our own CSS link after the Bootstrap link, right? Your CSS link goes second. So we can get those kinds of effects. I won't leave it as papyrus because that's kind of ugly. Okay. Cool. So that's the basic idea we can get with Bootstrap for applying utility classes. So again, there's lots of different options. I'm not going to go through every single thing you can do with Bootstrap styling. In general, if you want to make a page look in a particular way, you can go to the documentation, go to Bootstrap and say which category of utility seems like it might apply, and then go look at the examples and kind of figure out what's going to achieve the effect that you want. Okay. So these are an example of Bootstrap's utility classes. There's some other helpers as well. The other set of thing that Bootstrap provides as a set of right, is a set of right. So this is my line, right? If you want to know what kinds of bootstraps exist, you go to Bootstrap's documentation to find this example. So I did want to show a few more examples of other things that are sort of relevant and we can do with this. So the other things that you can note in Bootstrap is that it provides a set of what are called components. Components are not like utilities where you're saying make it this color, make it this border, make it this size, make it this display, make it a flex box. But they're actually ways of saying let's style elements to look like particular kinds of things on a page. So for example, we can style buttons. Buttons by default don't really look like a button, though if you sort of click on it and hold your mouse down, you can see the outline of the button. But we can add stylings to make our buttons look the way that we want. So for example, I have a submit button down here, which you can see normally it kind of looks like kind of blocky and squarey and very kind of like, late 90s button-y style. If I go down to Bootstrap, I can say, let's take this button element and I can give it a class. And I'm going to give it a class button, BTN, which is going to say style it to look like a Bootstrap button, which again, by default doesn't look like anything except until you click it and it sort of then shows you the outline, right? By default, it kind of has a gray border, no border and kind of a white background. But then if I give it a particular color styling, I can say I want this to be a primarily colored button. It becomes my nice blue button. In this case, primary here means like sort of the primary color of your theme. It is possible to theme Bootstrap so that it sort of matches your own color system. You can check the documentation for how that works. I'm not going to go into too much detail for this class. It's not relevant for sort of the level of work that we're doing. Right? I can make this a success button, and then I can make it green. Right? So I can, again, add some styling here to modify what my buttons look like, and then they have a nice effect. Like you hover over them, they get a little bit darker. They look like nice kinds of buttons. I'll flag just because I like it. I think that, and again, you can scroll through all the documentation and look at all the different options, right? You can make buttons bigger or smaller. You can make them disabled, right? If the button shouldn't be pressable. There's a bunch of different options we do. I'm going to note that I like, I just think that they look nice, are these outline buttons, right? Which are sort of just outlines, but when you mouse over them, they kind of fill in with the color. I don't know. I personally like it. I think they look really nice. I often use outline buttons, not because necessarily it's good, better usability. I just think they're cool. So I just use them. So yeah, so we can style buttons to look like buttons. The other thing that we can do actually with these button classes is we can actually style hyperlinks to also look like buttons. So for example, at the top of my page, I have this built with Bootstrap hyperlink, which when you click on it, it's just a link to Bootstrap's documentation. If I want it to not look like a link that's just text, I can make it look like a button by adding some styling to it, right? I can give it the button class, and I can give it button light. Let's make it a light colored button. Ta-da! Now I have a button, and when I click that button, it takes me to this other page. Now, what I've done and what I'm really clear about here is that this thing here, right, even though it looks like this, it isn't a button. It's a hyperlink. It's an anchor element. It's not a button element. The reason it's a hyperlink is because it goes to another page. It's for navigation, and that's what hyperlinks are for. Buttons are designed for submitting forms and interacting with the current page that you're on, not for going somewhere else. So Bootstrap makes it pretty easy to let me write semantic HTML, right? That is meaningful to things like screen readers. That's meaningful for things like web crawlers. It basically says that the HTML is what it says it's going to do, but I can style it to make it look like the kinds of things that I might want to look like. I can make it look like a button. All right, so that's one example of those kinds of components we can use. Other components that are relevant that you might find interesting, there are card components that will make things to look like cards. Again, these are going to add things like they'll add particular borders, they add some spacing, they add some styling, and so forth. The way that we often figure out how to use these different components, these different sets of classes, is that we look at the example HTML, and then we look at the example sort of card, and we sort of figure out what does what. So notice that this thing has a class card, right? The class card clearly is doing something. That's probably a good place to start. They've hard-coded in a width for this example. We don't want to do that, right? We never hard-code in widths. We always want to be able to use like styling work. They've given a card body, and we can then look up, again, they'll sort of be able to define, here's what a body does, right? A body, you use a card body when you want to add extra padding within a card. It adds things like a card title, which defines the title, a card text that defines some text. So what we can do is we can use this to be able to style our elements in order to make things that sort of look like cards with images and so forth alongside them. So there's a lot of different utilities that we can use to do this work. Some of these are what are also called interactive utilities, which I'll show, like, for example, like a collapsible utility that makes things appear and disappear. We'll talk about how to include these more in a future video when we get to some interactivity work, but Bootstrap does provide that pretty readily if you want to be able to include some basic some basic sort of visual interactivity bits. All right. And so that's the basic idea, right? Again, you can style buttons, you can make groups of buttons. Bootstrap has a lot of good styling for forms. There's actually a whole section on forms. Forms are very complex to style, and Bootstrap does a good job of making them. For example, you can use form controls to make input elements look like sort of nice, big, blocky input elements that fill up a page. You can also use input groups to make sort of neat effects where you have like the input box and then a label sort of attached to it as a piece. Again, there's lots of these stylings, and the way you achieve this effect is simply by adding classes. There's nothing magical about these classes. They're just saying there happens to be a rule that says if an element has that class, apply this styling to it. So all we're doing is we add classes to elements, which then cause that rule over there that Bootstrap's included to kick in and start styling our page the way we want. So it's just CSS exactly like you've used before. It's just that instead of you having to find a rule that works this way, you can say, oh, the rule already exists. Let me add the class, and the element will then get the styling because a rule applies to it now that I've marked it as should be applied by this rule by giving it a particular class. Okay, cool. So yeah, the last thing I want to just double check to note. I'm gonna go back to sizing, or I'll use sizing an example. If you want to specify the width of something, you can do that, right? There's a W25, W50, W75. That's going to let you specify sort of how big things are going to be. Note that there isn't a W30 or a W78, right? You can't pick your own numbers because, again, these aren't like being calculated programmatically. Just like with spacing, like there isn't a 2.5 or there isn't a 1.5 or there isn't even an MB6, right? That doesn't exist. They only go up to 5. And it's not because these numbers are being used to calculate some kind of spacing. It's more of that there just happens to be a class, and people who wrote Bootstrap just wrote out PBs 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in order to be able to get it the way that it wants. Okay. Oh, I don't want PB5. I want PB like 2. That was good. So yeah, so that's the basics of using Bootstrap. When people say they know how to use Bootstrap, what they really tend to mean is that they know a bunch of different utility classes and how to sort of achieve a particular effect. We're not going to go through every example. I'm going to leave that for you to sort of research and sort of check in documentation and search around your own. But that's how we sort of do a lot of this learning on the web stuff, is we'll be able to say, hey, look, here's where I can figure out how to do all kinds of styling bits. Let me go to that documentation. Let me look at that example, figure out what class I want to use, and experiment with it to see if it looks the way I want. And you saw me doing that, right? Where I was like, let me figure out how much spacing I want. Like, you might say, like, well, I don't know how much padding I want. Let's try a 3. What does a 3 look like? That looks okay. Maybe it's a little big. Maybe I'm going to go back to 2 just because I'm sort of not thrilled with how it looks. So a lot of this can be experimentation, which is fine. That's what we do in programming in order to get the kinds of effects that you really want. All right. So, yep. So that's the basic idea of Bootstrap. When in doubt, if you're looking for more utility classes or more ways of how to use Bootstrap, go to their documentation, look up the kinds of things for the kind of effects you want. You can also search around on the web to say, how did I do this particular effect with Bootstrap? And you'll probably then figure out which classes you need to use. All right, great. In the next video, I'm going to talk about doing some other things with Bootstrap, some other sets of classes, namely that we use to make Bootstrap responsive. So tune into that video as well.